organizing efforts / yours. Oh, there we go. Okay. We are live. Great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm Morgan Harper, based in Columbus, Ohio. We are co-sponsoring my new organization, Columbus Stand Up, this with Our Revolution Ohio, to get us all up to speed on what exactly are the arcane procedures by which our nation elects a president after election day. And we have a very special guest to walk through all of that with us today, Zach Malitz. Very excited to have Zach here with us today. And just to give you all a little bit of background about Zach, so he has led advocacy and candidate campaigns for climate justice, civil liberties, racial justice. He's a partner at an organization called The Social Practice and is a co-founder of the Real Justice PAC. And he also has been involved previously with both Beto O'Rourke and Bernie campaigns and based in Texas. So Zach, thank you very much for coming to, well, virtually coming to Ohio and sharing your expertise with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Glad to be here.
So Zach and a couple of others have created a guide called The Count, and that's what he's going to walk us through today. But just for background, I mean, we all have heard a lot about what Trump and Pence are threatening, which is that they will not commit to a peaceful transfer of power. And the main idea here is, while we're all doing all we can to turn out the vote and make sure that we have a historic turnout to try to put an end to this national crisis that is our current federal leadership, that we also need to be getting prepared for all the various scenarios that could play out on November 3rd and beyond. And so that's what Zach is going to walk us through today or this evening. And Zach, I'll turn it over to you to walk us through. But just so you know, we have a link to the Count guide that Zach put together that we'll share. And then also we want this to be interactive. So if you have any questions, please feel free to lob them into the chat or the Q&A throughout, and we'll do our best to monitor and get some responses from Zach. So with that, Zach, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks so much, Morgan. I am going to share my screen so we can go through a deck that we have. All right. Morgan, can you see this? All right, great. So the quick sort of point on who we are. So, Morgan introduced me. My co-authors on the guide are Brandon Evans. Brandon is sort of one of the top political operatives in Pennsylvania. He helped elect, Philadelphia Mayor Jim Kenney and District Attorney Larry Krasner, who's formerly the, director of Working Families Party Pennsylvania, and is the national political director of the Real Justice PAC. Becky Bond is the third co-author. She wrote a book called Rules for Revolutionaries about her experience on the Bernie 2016 campaign. And also works with me at the Social Practice, and Brandon and I at the Real Justice PAC. So the genesis of this guide is that we have been paying attention to the things that Trump has been saying about the election. And he has said repeatedly that if he loses, he may not accept the results of the election. Here he said, get rid of the mail-in ballots and you'll have a very peaceful, there won't be a transfer, frankly, there'll be a continuation. And this is after he was asked about a peaceful transfer of power and whether he'll accept the results of the election. And he has repeatedly said that the only way that he'll lose is if Democrats commit mass voter fraud. The premise of the guide is that we've chosen to take him at his word. Many people have dismissed this as just talk. It would be completely unprecedented for a president to directly and openly, refuse to accept the results of an election. But we've been really influenced by the work of Masha Gessen, who's a Russian-American journalist. And right after the election, they wrote a piece in the New York Review of Books called Autocracy Rules for Survival. And the first rule is to believe the autocrat. And so the premise of the guide is that Trump has been telling us what he intends to do, and that we should take those promises at face value and prepare for a protracted conflict after Election Day. This could be a no-holds-barred fight to save our democracy. And so we have to prepare ourselves psychologically and politically to fight to save our democracy and protect the Constitution. So first, we're going to start with understanding how we actually elect presidents in the United States. I didn't know almost anything about this a few months ago, and it's been a real crash course to learn about the, as Morgan said, arcane process by which we actually choose the president. So under our Constitution, citizens don't vote directly for a presidential ticket, even if that's the box they check on their ballot. They vote for what are called electors, and these are actual people chosen by the chair of the state party and pledged to vote for a particular presidential candidate. So the electors are collectively referred to as the Electoral College, and they're the ones who actually vote to elect the president. Congress then counts Electoral College votes and determines who won the presidency. And we don't actually have a determined winner of the presidency until Congress counts the Electoral College votes. So it's a three-step process. First, voters vote. Second, the electors that they choose vote for president. And then third, Congress counts the Electoral College votes and determine who won the presidency. So I'm going to go through the key dates as this process unfolds. So of course, we all know November 3rd is Election Day. Unlike in many presidential elections, we are not likely to know which candidate won on election night. I'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, because this is pretty important for understanding the dynamics of a contested election. The first important date after Election Day is December 8th, and this is called the Safe Harbor deadline. Federal law creates a strong incentive for states to complete and certify their ballot count by December 8th. Some states have, certification deadlines that are earlier, in some cases significantly earlier than December 8th, but this is the deadline set by federal law. And if a state doesn't complete its ballot count by December 8th, it risks not having its Electoral College votes counted by Congress. And it may be excluded from the final total that determines who the president is. 6 days later, on December 14th, is the deadline by which the governor of each state must report the election results to Congress. And so the governor certifies who won the state and then notifies Congress of which slate of electors are appointed, whether it's Biden's electors or Trump's electors. They do this by sending what's called a certificate of ascertainment to Congress, and then they appoint the slate of electors who will then vote in the Electoral College. Also on December 14th, the Electoral College meets. So in each state, the winning candidate's slate of pledged electors meet, usually in the state's state house. They cast their votes and they send a record of their votes to Congress. On January 3rd, the new Congress is sworn in. So it's not going to be the current Congress that counts Electoral College votes. It's going to be the one sworn in on January 3rd. So if somebody is elected to the Senate or elected to the House on November 3rd, that person will be part of the group of representatives or senators who votes to count the Electoral College votes after they're cast. Finally, on January 6th, Congress convenes in a joint session held in the House chamber to count Electoral College votes and choose the next president. Of course, Inauguration Day is January 20th. Typically, the new president is sworn in as the president, the vice president is sworn in as the vice president. If that doesn't happen, if we don't have a president at this point, the newly elected vice president is sworn in as acting president. If we have neither a new president nor a new vice president, then the Speaker of the House is sworn in as acting president until Congress determines who won the presidential election. So that's how the process normally works and the timeline. And it's important to understand that, to understand exactly what the threat that Trump poses to the electoral system. And when people hear about Trump refusing to accept the results of the election, or there not being a peaceful transfer of power, a lot of people imagine on January 20th, when Biden is supposed to be inaugurated, Trump just refuses to leave the White House and he asserts, sure, I lost the election, but I'm still the president, and Secret Service maybe has to drag him out or something like that. But that's not what's going to happen. If Trump overturns the results of the election, it will have the appearance of a legal process, and Trump and his allies will try and give it some veneer of democratic legitimacy. So here's the Republican playbook. There's three important parts. The first is to make it harder for Democrats to vote. They do this with all sorts of voter suppression tactics, right? Voter ID laws, creating barriers to registration, closing polling locations, intimidation at the polls, right? We saw Trump during the first presidential debate call on his supporters to go to the polls, watch the ballots, which is code for intimidating voters. The Trump campaign is organizing, they say, 50,000 poll watchers, who we expect will practice widespread voter intimidation. So the first part of their playbook is to reduce the number of Democrats who vote in the first place.
Here in Ohio, also not installing more drop boxes, which has been a big point of controversy.
Same here in Texas. Our wonderful Governor Greg Abbott made an attempt to restrict it to one drop box per county, no matter how many people live there. The second part happens after the election, and this is actually even more important, is to prevent Democratic votes in swing states, especially mail-in ballots, from being fully and accurately counted. So we can expect that after November 3rd, the Trump campaign will have a multi-pronged strategy to prevent and delay ballots from being counted. That'll include legal and administrative challenges to specific ballots. It could mean asking for recounts to try and slow things down and delay the count past the December 8th safe harbor deadline. It may even be physical disruptions of the vote count, right? We could imagine, members of right-wing militias trying to storm boards of elections to physically halt the counting of ballots. It could also be Trump ordering, federal agents from the Department of Justice to go seize ballots or slow things down by investigating election administrators. Third is that Trump will then use the chaos that he's created to convince Republican legislators to overturn the results of the election by appointing fraudulent and competing slates of Trump electors in order to throw the election to Congress. And talk a lot more in a second about what that looks like. The Democrats, to counter this, must also do three things. The first is they have to fight to make sure that every ballot is accurately counted by December 8th. Unless and until a fair and complete count shows that Biden lost the election, he must not concede to Trump. We cannot allow the results of a partial vote count to determine the outcome of the election. Biden has to be ready to take the fight all the way to Congress. Second, if Republican legislators try to stop Biden from winning a state's electoral college votes by appointing a fraudulent slate of Trump electors, Democratic governors have to appoint a competing slate of Biden electors. And they have to do that even if Republicans succeed in preventing all ballots from being counted before December 14th when the electoral college meets. So we can imagine a scenario where, Trump successfully files enough legal and administrative challenges in a state to prevent the ballots from all being counted by December 14th when the electoral college meets. His allies in the state legislature could then argue the election has failed. We have to make Trump the winner of our electoral college votes, even though the ballots haven't been counted. If that happens, the Democratic governor, in let's say Pennsylvania, has to then step in and appoint, legislators directly. And third, Democrats in Congress must use every procedural and legal means available to ensure that Biden wins the electoral college count. So if Republicans appoint fraudulent Trump electors, Democrats need to do everything that they can to prevent those electors' votes from being counted on January 6th. And they should, that's up to and including preventing the count from happening at all so that Nancy Pelosi becomes president on January 20th, which we can use as leverage to get Trump to concede and accept the results of the election. So before we go any further, and I'm going to unpack everything that I just said, because I know if this is new to you, that was probably a lot. So don't worry, I'm going to go through that step by step. But an important concept to understand that's going to shape the dynamics of this race is called the red mirage. So unlike in most presidential elections recently, we are not likely to know the winner of the 2020 race on election night. If it's a complete Biden blowout, and Biden, let's say, wins Ohio, which counts votes quickly, we'll be pretty sure then on election night that he's the winner. But if this is close and the race comes down to states that don't start counting mail-in ballots until election day, right? Say Michigan or Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, then we're in for potentially days or weeks of counting votes. And that's because, and what this will look like is that in a close election on election night, Trump will lead in the ballot count, even if he's eventually going to lose. And that's because Democrats are disproportionately likely to vote by mail, and the mail-in ballots are going to take longer to count. So we could see a scenario where the ballot count on election night has Trump in the lead, and then as the days and weeks following the election, pass and we count the mail-in ballots, it becomes clear that Biden won by a comfortable margin. Now, this is going to be crucial to shaping Trump's narrative because on election night, he's going to declare victory. He'll say that any votes that are counted after election day are fraudulent and are the result of Democrats trying to steal the election. And he'll call on state election administrators to stop counting. So this is important because, this is the first step in laying a narrative foundation for stealing the election. So between November 3rd and when the electoral college meets on December 14th, this is the stage where the ballots are counted, right? And so during the ballot count, Trump will have two important goals. The first is to create delays and prevent as many Democratic voters' ballots from being counted before the December 8th safe harbor deadline. And the second is to create a perception of chaos to delegitimize the election results. And if he succeeds in the first one and prevents enough Democratic ballots from being counted, he may be able to maintain a lead that he holds on election night by illegitimately preventing ballots from being counted. What matters most, though, is not actually the ballot count. It's public perception of the integrity of the election. Trump's goal is to create enough chaos and enough uncertainty and doubt that the public wonders whether the results of the election are legitimate, and it creates a pretext for state legislatures to step in and directly appoint electors, even though the ballot count is incomplete, and we don't actually know whether Trump won. So winning the ballot count, by preventing Democrats' votes from being counted, that's a political tactic, not a legal strategy, right? It's actually Congress that makes the final decision about which electoral college votes to count and which ones to discard. So just because Trump halts the ballot count and has the lead, when the electoral college meets, that doesn't actually make him the president. It's the governor of the state, and if the legislature steps in illegitimately to appoint Trump electors, then they may send a second slate of electors that decides who actually votes in the electoral college, and then ultimately Congress counts the votes. So even if Trump's supporters illegitimately and illegally appoint Trump electors, ultimately Congress is the one that decides which electors were legally or illegally appointed. So the two triggers for if we're in a constitutional crisis are these. First, if Trump and his allies attempt to prevent every ballot from being counted. And second, if in a state that Biden wins, Trump's electors, likely illegally appointed by the state legislature, meet, vote for Trump, and send a record of their votes to Congress. So the first of these is if we see the Trump campaign file bad faith lawsuits, legal challenges, administrative challenges to ballots, and they transparently have the goal of ensuring that not everyone's ballots are counted, that not every voice is heard in the election, in order to prevent Biden from legitimately winning the election. That's the first trigger, right? This is an attempt to overturn the results of the election with lawfare and by preventing a valid and democratic count of the ballots. If that happens, then this stops being an election between two candidates and it becomes an attempted coup. Second is that, if typically what happens is a state completes its ballot count, the governor certifies the election results, and then appoints electors, and those electors vote and send their votes to Congress, right? If, however, the legislature steps in and appoints electors, and this has happened occasionally in American history, but rarely, if the legislature asserts that it actually has the authority to appoint electors directly, in spite of the ballot count being incomplete or Biden being in the lead in the ballot count, again, we're in a constitutional crisis where Republicans in a swing state are trying to overturn the results of an election.
Zach, we have one question.
Yep.
Just to clarify, when you say Congress decides which electors, are you referring to the House, Senate, or some combination?
It is a joint session of Congress, so both the House and the Senate meet together, and if there's a dispute over which electors to count, each chamber meets separately and each one votes. And I'll talk a little bit more about the different scenarios in a second about how that works and the mechanics of those votes, but it is both chambers of Congress.
Great.
So if Trump successfully prevents all of Biden's voters' ballots from being counted before the Electoral College meets, or if Republican legislators appoint fraudulent electors, and this is most likely to happen in Pennsylvania, Michigan, or Wisconsin, where, first, they're likely to be pivotal in a close election, and second, there's a Democratic governor and a Republican state legislature, right? So these are the places where if the Democratic governor is following the rules, the Republican legislature may try and overturn the results, right? So if Trump takes the lead by preventing all the ballots from being counted, or Republican legislators trying to overturn the results of the election, then the Democratic governor in those states, whichever one is being contested, must appoint Biden's electors to the Electoral College. And they have to do that even if the ballot count isn't complete, right? If on December 14th, as a result of Trump preventing and delaying ballots from being counted, if he holds a partial lead in one of these states, the Democratic governor has to appoint Democratic electors anyways, because the reason that the ballot count isn't incomplete is because of a malicious attempt to overturn the results of the election. And so the Democratic governor is then in the position of having to fend off a coup, right? They're the first line of defense against Trump's efforts to steal the election. And the most important tactic then is to appoint Biden's electors, which gives Congress the opportunity and the option to make Biden the president and determine that he actually won that state once all the ballots are counted. And this is something else that's important is, so December 8th, the safe harbor deadline is an artificial deadline, right? Federal law incentivizes states to stop counting before then and to certify their results. But it's actually not a legal requirement that they do complete it. A state could keep counting the ballots until January 6th when Congress votes. And so if Trump and his allies are successful in delaying the vote count in a state past December 14th when the Electoral College meets, an important demand is to ensure that that state continues to count ballots even after the Electoral College meets, right? So if Trump and his allies meddle with the ballot count or appoint fraudulent electors, the game plan for Democrats in that state is to appoint Biden electors, send them to Congress, and then continue to count ballots to attempt to determine, that Biden actually won the race there once all the ballots are counted. So some important action steps between November 3rd and December 14th. So the first is that Biden must not concede. No matter what, unless and until every single ballot has been counted and it becomes clear that Trump is the legitimate winner of the election, Biden must not concede. If Biden concedes, then we all lose, and he effectively silences millions of voters who voted legitimately to make him the president, but who, as a result of his concession, is handing Trump a fraudulent victory. The second is that all of us, people supporting Joe Biden, on election day need to declare victory and argue that Biden has a pathway to victory. All of the polls that have been conducted, close analyses of the early vote returns so far, and likely additional analyses immediately after the election, will show that Biden is clearly in the lead and has a clear pathway to victory once all the ballots have been counted. Trump will declare victory, and he'll argue that the remaining ballots are fraudulent. We can't cede the narrative ground to him. We have to step in and tell the truth, which is that once all the ballots are counted, if we follow the legitimate democratic process, that Biden will be the president. The third is that we have to demand a complete ballot count. And this is, of course, obvious. This is what you do in a democracy, but it's important to remember the key to Trump's post-election strategy will be ensuring that not all of the ballots are counted. And we have to stand on the side of democratic legitimacy and say, we want all of the ballots counted because counting all the ballots is what determines who won the election. And we have to count them. It doesn't matter how long it takes. Even if we go past the safe harbor deadline of December 8th, even if we go past the December 14th deadline when the Electoral College meets, we have to count all the ballots no matter what, because we cannot allow Trump to be elected president, even though he legitimately lost the election. Fourth, as I've already said, if the Republicans meddle in the results of the election, if they prevent all the ballots from being counted, or if they appoint fraudulent electors, the governors in the states that are contested need to appoint Biden electors and send them to Congress. And finally, as I know many of the people on this webinar are doing, we need to protest en masse immediately after the election. It's going to take millions of people in the streets to ensure that we have a legitimate election. Trump has already threatened the integrity of the election, the integrity of our democracy, and we have to be vigilant immediately after the election to ensure that the process unfolds as it's intended to. After the Electoral College meets on December 14th, the fight moves to Congress. And so the important date again is January 6th, which is when both chambers of Congress convene to count the Electoral College votes. And so the scenario that we're imagining here is that a pivotal swing state or multiple pivotal swing states, and for the sake of argument, let's just assume it's one state and that state is Pennsylvania, right? Let's say the election comes down to the results in Pennsylvania. Whoever wins Pennsylvania becomes the president. The scenario we're talking about here is that Biden wins Pennsylvania legitimately, but as a result of chaos created after the election, Trump's allies in the legislature appoint illegitimate Trump electors, while the governor in Pennsylvania appoints legitimate Biden electors. And so Pennsylvania sends two competing slates of electors to Congress, and Congress has to vote to sort out which of those slates to count. And the determination of which slate to count will determine who the president is. So that sounds like it should be easy because there are laws that determine who wins and loses in a state, which electors are legitimate and illegitimate. The problem is that Congress is the authority that's responsible for enforcing the law and for determining which slate of electors is and is not legitimately appointed. And the Constitution doesn't anticipate this kind of crisis. The Constitution doesn't say anything about how Congress determines who the winner is or how it counts electoral college votes or what to do if there are two competing slates of electors in a dispute over who legitimately won a state. There is a 19th century law called the Electoral Count Act that was intended to create a process for this type of dispute to be resolved, but that law is famously convoluted, and even more important, it's been virtually untested. We've never used it to resolve a contested election before, and so it's unclear whether it's even constitutional. It's unclear how it will be interpreted. A mainstream interpretation is that if the two houses vote to determine which slate of electors is legitimate and they disagree, then by default the governor's slate of electors are appointed. But though it's a mainstream view, there's not a consensus on that. And again, until it's legally tested, we don't actually know what the result will be. So the upshot of that is that the fight in Congress is going to be a political contest, not a legal contest. The Constitution clearly gives Congress the authority and responsibility of determining who won the election. It's very unlikely that the Supreme Court will step in to determine who the president is. It's likely going to be a political settlement in Congress that determines the outcome of the election if there's a dispute over electors.
And Zach, I know you're probably getting to this later, but just want to make sure so you can decide whether to address now or if it's later in the presentation. But that statement you just made, unlikely the courts will step in to resolve this. We have a question related to Bush v. Gore. Wouldn't that precedent hold? So why is that the case, and why wouldn't the court be deciding?
That's a great question. So what Bush v. Gore decided was whether to continue a recount in Florida. So the courts will likely intervene in disputes over which ballots to count and which ones not to count. But once the fight moves to Congress and Congress is determining which competing slate of electors to count, it is unlikely that the courts will intervene. The most recent, and this is not the type of scenario that happened in 2000. In 2000, before the fight moved to Congress, Al Gore conceded, right? His electors didn't meet and send a competing slate to Congress. Instead, he said, for the sake of the country, I'm going to concede. The most recent historical, parallel here is the contested election of 1876, where 4 states did send competing slates of electors to Congress, and Congress was forced to forge a political resolution. In that case, the Supreme Court did not intervene to determine who won the presidential election. And the political compromise to determine who won that election wasn't brokered until 2 days before the inauguration. So the most recent precedent suggests that, because the separation of powers in the Constitution gives Congress ultimate authority to decide who the president is, and the Supreme Court may step in to determine, for example, how to interpret the Electoral Count Act, but actually determining which slate of electors to count or who the president is. While we have no idea, right? It's the Supreme Court could do anything, but the general view is that it's not likely that the Supreme Court will intervene in that scenario, that this will be a fight that plays out in Congress and that Congress will determine who the president is. So an upshot of this is that if Democrats act like legal scholars while Republicans fight a guerrilla war to make Trump the president at any cost, Democrats will risk losing a presidency despite winning the majority of electoral votes at the polls. This is because this is happening essentially in a legal vacuum, because the laws that govern it are untested, and crucially because the interpretation of those laws will likely come down to political pressure from outside of Congress. It's going to be whoever rallies the American public to their cause, whoever builds massive public support for making Biden the president or making Trump the president, that's most likely to carry the day. If things go to Congress, the way that we win is by making it clear that a vast supermajority of Americans want every ballot counted, want legitimate electors counted, and won't tolerate a coup. So there are some very specific things that need to happen in Congress if we get to this point. So the first is that Congress should use every procedural tactic available to delay. If Democrats feel like they cannot stop Trump's illegitimate electors from being counted, they should essentially shut down the count through any means necessary. They have a few options for this. The first is that they can call a House recess and delay the count. Right, so this might be Nancy Pelosi ordering the Sergeant at Arms to actually remove Mike Pence and the Republicans in the Senate from the House chamber, and then delaying the count indefinitely unless and until Trump concedes. It might be organizing and participating in mass civil disobedience at the Capitol to delay indefinitely a vote. And then a sort of a nuclear option, if Democrats don't win the Senate, would be for them to use a procedural maneuver to delay seating incoming senators. So 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election, roughly 1/3. And on January 3rd, the other 2/3 of the Senate have to vote to seat the incoming 1/3 of the Senate. In the 2/3 of remaining senators, Democrats have a 35-30 majority. And so they could take a procedural vote to delay voting on seating incoming senators until after the Electoral College votes are counted, ensuring that Democrats have a majority in the Senate. If Democrats control both the House and the Senate when they vote to determine which electors to count, it's most likely that they're going to win. What's difficult is if government is divided, if we don't win the Senate. And so in that case, the Democrats have this sort of nuclear option to maintain a majority in the Senate, even if they don't win enough Senate seats in the November 3rd election. Finally, it's important to understand deadlock is preferable to a Trump coup. What we're talking about is not a legitimate contest between presidential candidates. Trump essentially forfeits his right to win an electoral college majority as soon as he interferes with the smooth functioning of our democratic system, as soon as he tries to win the presidency, even though he didn't win through legitimate means. That's a coup, not an election. And so no matter what, Democrats have to stop it if it moves to that point. And that may just mean that they shut down the House and Senate, prevent a vote from happening at all, and ensure that Pelosi is sworn in as the acting president on January 20th, and that she holds the office until Republicans and Trump give in and Trump concedes, or Republicans agree to count legitimate electors, appointed to the Electoral College. Then for the
Zach, we have one question. So, this gets into just like the timing of things, because someone's asking so who exactly is in Congress to be counting ballots if there's a delay? Because we have some people who are on the ballot to be in Congress, and then others who might not be there. So can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yep. So it'll be the new Congress that's sworn in. So if, for example, somebody is elected for the first time following the November 3rd election, they will be in the House or Senate when that chamber votes to resolve a dispute over electors. So it's 3 days before January 6th on January 3rd that the new Congress is sworn in. So if somebody loses their seat in this election, they're not going to be in Congress for this vote, which is why it's possible that even though Democrats don't control the Senate now, that they may control the Senate and the House during a dispute over electors. And if that's the case, and this is why it's so important to win the Senate, if that's the case, then we have a pretty strong firewall in Congress to prevent illegitimate Trump electors from being counted. Now, so for the rest of us, while this fight is playing out in Congress, we have to essentially shut down the country. Mass protests, mass strikes, mass civil disobedience. We need to shut down the normal functioning of the country unless and until Trump concedes or Biden is inaugurated as the next president. Again, what we'll be facing in this scenario is not the appropriate and legitimate counting of votes to determine who the president is, but an illegitimate attempt to usurp the presidency through a coup. And if that happens, the ultimate and most important check on, autocratic attempt to take over the presidency is for all of us to be in the streets and to make it clear that, we the people will not tolerate a coup or the, autocrat usurping the presidency. And the second is that we have to pressure the Supreme Court to back Biden or to remain neutral. Now, like I said, it's most likely the Supreme Court will not intervene. The wild card here is that the Supreme Court will have a large conservative majority on it, and that 3 of those justices, assuming Barrett is successfully put onto the court, 3 of them will have been appointed by Trump. And so we need to make it clear first, the Supreme Court shouldn't intervene at all unless it's to ensure that the legitimate electors that were appointed, and pledged to Joe Biden, are counted and that Trump's illegitimately appointed electors are discarded. And if it does intervene, it should do so in a neutral and impartial way, which means that the justices appointed by Trump should recuse themselves from the decision. So we want to put immediate pressure on the Supreme Court. And we know from past experience that the Supreme Court, even though it's deeply ideological, is sensitive to public pressure. So Bush v. Gore, for example, badly damaged the credibility of the court and undermined its legitimacy. And so even conservative justices on the court are likely to be sensitive to public pressure and sensitive to the perception of the legitimacy of the court. And so protesting to demand that the Supreme Court respect democracy and not try and give legal sanction to a coup is part of what we should be doing at this point, while we're backing Democrats in Congress who take extraordinary measures to prevent Trump's electors from being appointed. So just to wrap up here, Here's a quote from the Transition Integrity Project, which
actually, Zach, sorry,
yeah.
I'm going to pause because so Peggy has clarified her question a little bit. So yeah, but if you're advocating for the ballot count to stop, for example, that also is going to stop all the the counting of down ballot races as well. So then we won't have clarity on who's winning some of the congressional seats. I think that's what Peggy's getting at.
That is a distinct possibility. Now, the ballot count in most states we should expect, be easily completed. And crucially, in down ballot races, there is not the same certification deadline as there is in the presidential, right? So long as the results are sorted out by January 3rd, there should be no problem seating incoming representatives or senators. It is possible that if in a couple of states where the election is contested and the ballot count is badly delayed by the Trump campaign, that we may have a few seats that are undecided. It's probably unlikely that will determine who controls the House or Senate. Democrats should comfortably win the House, and the Senate is a little bit more unlikely, or it's a little bit more uncertain. But again, Democrats always have the nuclear option of simply refusing to seat incoming senators to maintain a 35-30 majority, which they should absolutely use if, as a result of the Trump campaign and Republicans preventing ballots from being counted and interfering with the operations of the election, we don't know who some of the senators are.
Another question, which states have faithful electors?
That's a good question. So Pennsylvania, for example, does not have, so a faithless elector, let's just define this for people who don't know it. A faithless elector is someone who's pledged to a particular candidate, but then votes for a different candidate when the Electoral College meets. The landscape on this varies state to state. Some crucial swing states like Pennsylvania do not have laws prohibiting faithless electors. Here's what I'll say. It is very unlikely that the results of the election will come down to faithless electors. At most, it's a couple of faithless electors have changed their votes in a given election, and it's never been the case that a presidential election has been decided by faithless electors. If there one would have been, it probably would have been 2016, when there was a major effort to organize Republican electors to reject Trump, and that didn't happen. I think we can expect that, because these are people who are handpicked for their loyalty to the party and to their candidate. It'd have to be some sort of Manchurian candidate, faithless elector, and there'd have to be a lot of them. Since we're talking at most one or two of them, and it's unlikely the election will come down to one or two electors.
And then last question, I think, on the congressional situation, would Kamala have to recuse herself from voting?
I don't believe so. That's a good question. I have not seen anything on that, but I do not think she would. But Mike Pence, for example, does not have to recuse himself from presiding over the joint session. And I've never seen anything to indicate that Harris would not be able to vote.
Great. And there are other questions get into what can we do even if we're not in one of these states where it's a contested count, which I think is a good transition to next part.
That is a really good question. I'll address that in a second. Let me go through this really quickly. So, the Transition Integrity Project did tabletop simulations of a contested election. And their major finding was that we can't look to the courts or institutions or norms to resolve this. It's going to be a street fight where public protest and political narrative largely determine the outcome, because it boils down to what is perceived as democratically legitimate, which will largely shape the behavior of institutions and elected officials in this kind of fight. So I just want to draw one quick lesson before we conclude, and I answer the great question about what people outside of these swing states can do. So in 2000, Al Gore allowed George W. Bush to steal the election because he conceded rather than taking the fight all the way to Congress. So as I said earlier, the Supreme Court halted the recount, but Gore's electors could have voted, and sent a competing slate of electors to Congress. And then Gore could have taken the fight to Congress and argued that the election was stolen from him in Florida, and Bush's ballot count there was illegitimate. But he didn't, because for the sake of political unity and unifying the country and maintaining political stability, he conceded to Bush. And that's really admirable in a lot of ways, but against someone like Trump, Biden must not do that. And it's also the case that Gore and Bush fought that battle really differently. Gore put his faith in the legal system. He, didn't talk to the American public about what was going on. It devolved into arcane procedures in the Senate or in the Supreme Court, and he told labor unions and other Democratic aligned organizations to stand down and not to protest. The Republicans, meanwhile, waged a scorched earth PR campaign to paint Gore as a sore loser, won the American public largely over their side, and then they interfered directly with the ballot count. They treated this as a street fight and a political fight, while Gore put his faith in the legal system and treated it as a fundamental legal problem as opposed to a political one. Republicans, especially over the last 10 years, have shown that they're willing to be more ruthless, to play hardball, to violate political norms to win, and to take advantage of Democrats when they try and negotiate in good faith. The Supreme Court confirmation hearings are the best, most recent evidence we have of this. They're trying to, confirm a Trump-appointed Supreme Court justice to lock in a conservative majority literally days before the election. There's no reason to believe that Republicans in the swing states or in Congress will act in good faith. And so Democrats have to be willing to play by the same set of rules and play actual hardball by refusing to seat incoming senators, by delaying the count indefinitely if they can't win it, and ensuring that under no circumstances does Donald Trump become the president by illegitimately preventing ballots from being counted or by receiving illegitimate votes from Trump electors. This is going to be a battle of political will and raw power, and whoever rallies the American people to their side will ultimately have a huge advantage in how the inside game plays out, which gets to the question about what we should do and what people in the swing state, outside of swing state, should do. So the most important thing, which I know many people on this call are planning to do, is to protest and keep protesting. So Democrats control most of the key levers of power, right? They control the governor's office in the key swing states that would likely, be pivotal in this kind of contested election. And they control at least the House of Representatives and possibly the Senate, where they can have a firewall against Trump's electors being counted. But for them to win the inside game, they need mass public support from outside of Congress. And that's where all of you come in, is ensuring that day after day after day, people are protesting and saying, this is a coup. Trump is trying to steal the election. We demand that every ballot be counted. And we know that after every ballot is counted, Joe Biden will be the president. In Ohio, you have a particularly interesting strategy to making the case that Biden will win after all of the ballots are counted. And that's because your ballots, as I understand, will be counted much faster than they would be in, say, Pennsylvania. And so if things are even close in Ohio, that's a really good indication that Biden will have won in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, even if we don't have the vote totals from there. And so if Biden even comes within a couple points in Ohio, you can convincingly make the case, look, Biden came close here, or Biden won Ohio. And we know then that all the ballots, once they're counted in these other swing states, that he'll definitely be the president. It's also important that, you are not in a big coastal city, right? There needs to be, this can't be a thing where it looks like, what we're seeing is normal partisan polarization, right? Democratic legitimacy and democratic norms are transpartisan, and everyone should support them. And so demonstrating that there's political support for a resolution that ensures that the process works, all the ballots are counted, and Biden wins a legitimate victory, ensuring that people see that coming from Ohio and not just New York or the Bay Area, is really important for creating the kind of public pressure that we need to resolve this effectively. You can also organize your local elected officials, right? All of your elected officials, they're your city council members, county elected officials, mayors, your Democratic members of Congress, Senator Brown, anyone who's a Democrat in the state. They can all speak out. They can write op-eds. They can pass resolutions through city councils or county boards condemning Trump and the Republicans for trying to steal the election. They can join protests to demonstrate that even elected officials are in the streets protesting. They can use their voices, and also they can communicate with the public, right? People look to elected officials for leadership. And if our elected officials are saying, oh, this is a complicated legal dispute and we don't know what's going on, that sends a really different message to the public than this is a coup. Everyone needs to be in the streets to protect our democracy. And we should expect our elected officials everywhere to be sending that message and to be amplifying that message. And so immediately after the election, you should communicate with all of your elected officials even if they're not going to play a role in deciding the outcome of the election, their voices are going to be critical in shaping the narrative and determining ultimately who wins.
Thanks, Zach. We have a couple more questions. Well, one just related to the nature of the protesting and the action specifically. A question about, actions versus like a general strike. Are you advocating for protests on a daily basis? I know here in Columbus, we already have plans coming up for the day after the election, Saturday, but, do you have a vision of what exactly is like ideal scenario?
Yeah, so I think, I want to say first, we're all going to feel really different after the election, right? However much preparation we do, we're going to know so much more on November 4th than we know today. And so exactly what situation we're in, what the mood of the country is, and what kind of protests or we need to have, that's really going to be shaped by what happens on November 3rd. And so this could be really different. My advice is to protest and keep protesting, that we should be in the streets in some way or another every single day, ideally in every street, in every city in the country. Right, that this is not a time for us to be quiet. It's not a time for us to watch from our homes. This is a time to be in the streets in as large numbers as we can, to be vigilant and peacefully watch over the election to ensure that the right thing happens. I think it'd be really hard to organize a general strike on November 4th. If we see a full-on attempt at a coup in the United States, I think it's hard to know what people will be willing to do. I think any form of peaceful civil disobedience, any strike in any workplace, all those things are effective to send the message that what's happening is not normal and not legitimate, and that this is an election, it's an attempt to take over the country.
Thanks, Zach. And then a couple questions related to just what signaling we're getting from the Biden campaign, information coming out about, do they plan to take this all the way to Congress? Do we think that he'll concede? I know, obviously a little hard to say, but if you have any indications or thoughts on those questions.
The honest answer is I don't know. I'm not privy to the inside thinking of the Biden campaign. We do know from its public information that they are preparing for a long legal battle. But again, we can't. Of course, we have to fight out the legal fights, right? The Biden campaign is going to need to deal with a whole bunch of lawsuits and administrative challenges, and it's absolutely necessary for them to fight on that front. But if that's all they do, we're likely to lose, right? While that's happening, we also need to protest. We need to expect our elected officials to rally the American public to defend democracy, that sort of thing. And it may be the case that part of what we have to do is push the Biden campaign and push Joe Biden to stand up and tell the truth. And we need to create a political context where Biden can take the fight all the way to Congress, right? If we're not out there protesting, if we're not in the streets, if we're not sending the message, then it's going to be really hard for him to actually take the fight to Congress. We have to create the political context where he's able to do that.
Yeah, I think that's really important because it gets at maybe not a question, but a comment that we got in the chat just about, having to grow something and play hardball. But I think we have a role in that. And so creating conditions that make it clear what we want as a populace. And that's been one of the cool things about the Protest the Results initiative and the grassroots organizing that's happening in Columbus, I think, is it is pulling a lot of different types of people in, because this should be a message that everyone agrees with, that the will of the people should be reflected in the results of this election. So again, if folks haven't, signed up for that, please do. I think Diana is dropping more information in the chat, and we need to have, big numbers to indicate what we want and what we want from our political leaders in response to that expression of our will. Okay, we have another question. What can people do virtually given that they may be in high-risk COVID group? So other methods of applying that pressure, even if not physically showing up to an action.
That's a really good question. So because so many elected officials are going to play a crucial role in this, there's all kinds of ways of communicating with them. Protests are important, but making phone calls, writing letters, sending them emails, posting on their engaging with them on social media, all of those things are elected officials pay attention to them. And so you should engage with your own elected officials in Ohio that way and in your community. And don't hesitate to engage with elected officials in swing states if it comes down to it, right? If let's say it comes down to Pennsylvania and the ballot count isn't finished and the partial count shows Trump in the lead, and Governor Wolf faces this, sort of moment of decision about whether he's going to appoint Biden electors or not, he should hear from everyone in the country. Because again, that's a really bold and risky thing to do politically, and we have to create the political context for him to do that. And so you don't have to be in the streets to let him know that you have his back. You can write him a letter. you can call his office. You can engage with him on social media. And you can also call your friends and family and explain what's going on to them and rally them into the streets. You can ask other people who can protest safely to do that. There's going to be a role for everyone. You know, it doesn't matter if you can't be in the streets, you can't be out around other people, that's totally okay. There's going to be a ton that you can do.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Zach, for joining us. Thanks everybody for tuning in and submitting your questions. I will just give another shout out to the guide, the count guide document itself. It's really well organized. There's some more details about the Bush v. Gore situation. For example, page 15 on just like how wild that was. And please feel free to share that with other folks in your network. We'll have a recording of this session, and please share that as well to anyone who might be interested in getting organized. So thanks again. And thanks to Diane and Our Revolution of Ohio for allowing us to use the platform. We will be in touch with more information and hope to see you out if you can on November 4th. Thank you. And thanks, Zach, again. And tell Becky and Brandon thank you too, even though they couldn't join.
I will. Thank you.
Awesome.